"You're out of the family trust," my brother said, his lips curling in that half-smile he'd perfected since childhood. A smirk that wasn't just confidence, but a knife sharpened by years of entitlement. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He looked at the lawyer across the mahogany desk, as if my presence had already been erased by ink and paper. The room was too warm, smelling faintly of polished wood and stale coffee. The blinds filtered the afternoon sun into pale lines across the table. I remember the way the dust hung there, suspended, as if even the particles didn't dare move. Silence filled the air after his words, heavier than any gavel strike. I didn't answer. I let him have his smirk, his moment. But my silence wasn't consent. It was observation. It was memory. I was 68 that day, though in that moment I felt both older and younger. Older because betrayal has a way of adding decades to your bones. Younger because suddenly I was back to being the second son, the one who worked, who sacrificed, who carried weight without ever asking to be praised. Our father's trust had been built on a lifetime of discipline. He wasn't a man of excess, but a man of careful signatures, of paper stacked in neat piles, of numbers that balanced at the end of every ledger. I inherited that from him. My younger brother inherited only the smirk. When our parents grew old, it was me who paid the medical bills. I wrote checks that emptied my own savings to keep them in comfort. My brother visited occasionally, bearing flowers and photographs, but never invoices, never receipts. I never asked him to. I thought family was heavier than money. I was wrong. The trust meeting should have been simple, a review, a conversation, a signature or two. Instead, it became my erasure. The attorney, polite but neutral, slid papers across the desk with his long fingers. I caught the words amendment, removal, successor beneficiary in neat black print. My brother's smirk widened as he explained how things were now. "You've had your life, Richard," he said, finally looking at me. His tone carried the mock sweetness of someone speaking to a man already buried. "It's time for me to take the reins, you understand?" Understand? Yes. I understood betrayal dressed up as inheritance. I understood how greed could twist the word family into something unrecognizable. But what my brother didn't understand, what he could never understand, was silence. He thought silence was weakness. He thought my lack of protest was surrender. He had no idea silence could be a ledger too. I left the office without signing a thing. My brother stayed behind, leaning back in his chair like a king in a borrowed throne. I stepped into the crisp autumn air, the city sounds rushing back at me, car horns, footsteps on pavement, the low rumble of traffic. My breath made a faint fog in the air, though the day wasn't that cold. Betrayal has its own weather. I walked home. Each step struck the sidewalk like a metronome, steady, controlled. I thought of my father's voice, measured, calm, the way he would lecture us about debts and promises. "Numbers don't lie," he would say. "Paper doesn't forget. Paper doesn't forget." I unlocked the door to my apartment, hung up my coat, and sat down at my old oak desk. The same desk I had used for 30 years of banking. Its surface bore faint scratches, but the drawers were still smooth. I opened the top one, pulled out a folder, and began to place things in order. Birth certificates, property deeds, old tax receipts. No one at that law office had asked me for proof. They assumed the amendment was the whole truth. But I knew better. I knew there were records public, permanent, that stretched longer than any smirk across a lawyer's desk. Night fell. The city light spilled through my window, small squares of gold against the dark. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon, the kind my father used to keep for company but rarely drank himself. I let the liquid sit on my tongue. Slow, deliberate, I thought of the past. My father teaching me how to write my signature at 10 years old. My mother smiling faintly when I came home late from the bank, exhausted but steady. My younger brother bursting through doors with stories and jokes, always quick with charm, never with responsibility. I had carried the weight. He had carried the smile. And now he thought the smile had won. I set the empty glass down, steady against the wood. My hand did not shake. The days that followed were uneventful on the surface. I went about my routine. Coffee in the morning, a walk to the park, reading the paper, nodding politely at neighbors. But underneath, I was cataloging, assembling. I visited the county clerk's office, the records hall, the bank archives. To anyone else, it looked like the slow shuffle of an old man through public buildings. But I wasn't wandering. I was tracing. Deeds, transfers, titles, each one stamped, signed, filed. I saw patterns my brother could never see. He lived in smiles and shortcuts. I lived in paper and permanence. One afternoon, As I traced my fingers over an embossed seal on a property record, I felt the faintest spark of satisfaction. Not joy, not yet, just the recognition that silence had begun to speak. At dinner a week later, my brother laughed across the table, glass of wine in hand. Other relatives leaned toward him, feeding on his confidence. "Richard's comfortable enough," he said lightly, as if I were a ghost sitting among them. "Besides, he's not the sort to manage an estate anymore. He's past all that." I cut my steak with slow precision. I didn't look up. I didn't argue. My silence wrapped around me like armor. Inside, though, I counted not the cost of the meal, not the years of sacrifice, but the days until paper would catch up with him. The night after that dinner, I returned to my desk. The stack of documents had grown. My pen hovered over a yellow legal pad as I began to sketch timelines, clauses, loopholes. I wrote without rush, the way a man sharpens a blade he intends to use only once. Outside, the city quieted into its midnight rhythm. A siren wailed in the distance, then faded. The ticking of my clock was the only sound left. Each tick was another step closer. My brother believed he had won by erasing me, but he hadn't noticed that I was the one holding the ink. When I finally closed my notebook, the hour was late. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of wood loud in the silence. My eyes fell on a photograph framed on the shelf. My late wife, smiling in the sunlight, her hair caught in the breeze. She had always told me I was too patient, too forgiving, but she also knew I carried memory like stone. "Don't let them dishonor you," she once whispered in a hospital room, her hand frail, but her eyes fierce. I hadn't forgotten. I never would. By the time dawn touched the skyline, the first outline of my plan was complete. I folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the drawer, and poured myself another cup of coffee. My brother thought silence was absence, but silence was foundation. And I had only just begun to build. Morning light filtered through the blinds in narrow stripes. I sat at the kitchen table with a plain mug of black coffee. My notes spread before me like a patience chart. Numbers, dates, signatures, they weren't abstract to me. They were living, breathing evidence, waiting for the right moment to stand up in courtrooms and banks. I had spent my life in those places. I knew their rhythm. I knew how slowly they moved, how mercilessly they recorded. Banks didn't smile, and they didn't forget. They only balanced. That was where my brother would fail. He thought people mattered more than paper. He thought charm could bend a ledger. He thought laughter at a family dinner was the same as ownership. It wasn't. The first document I pulled was our father's original trust agreement, typed decades ago on a manual typewriter, its font sharp and mechanical, the ink slightly faded but permanent. In it, my father had named both sons as equal trustees with full rights and responsibilities to be executed jointly. That clause had never been revoked. The so-called amendment my brother had smirked about might have convinced the attorney, might have played well to the crowd at dinner, but it couldn't erase the public record. No court in this country would overlook such language. And yet I didn't rush to court. That would have been too obvious, too loud. Loudness wasn't my weapon. Silence was. I began instead with smaller steps, ones that left no ripples on the surface. At the clerk's office, I quietly requested certified copies of deeds attached to properties in the trust. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, didn't ask why. She simply fetched the books, pressed the stamp, and slid them across the counter. The weight of the embossed seal in my hands felt like a hammer, though I didn't swing it yet. Later, I spent an afternoon at the bank, nodding at familiar faces, who still remembered me as the loan officer who never bent the rules. Age had slowed my stride, but not my authority. In the vault of records, I traced loan agreements, cross-referenced signatures. I found one, an outstanding loan tied to property my brother now claimed as solely his. His signature glared back at me, neat but careless. He hadn't noticed that the collateral he pledged still required my co-signature to release, and I hadn't synced. That evening, I walked home slowly, carrying only a manila envelope. The street smelled of wet asphalt after a light rain, headlights smeared across the pavement. People hurried past with umbrellas, their chatter rising and falling in waves. I felt calm. There was no need to hurry. Revenge, like interest, compounded quietly over time. When I reached my apartment, I set the envelope on the desk, next to the bourbon glass I hadn't washed from nights before. I sat down, rested my palms flat against the wood, and let the silence stretch. My brother believed victory was a performance. I knew better. Victory was a process. 2 weeks later, at another family gathering, he was louder than ever. His laughter filled the room like cheap perfume cloying, hard to escape. "You should have seen the look on Richard's face," he he told our cousins, smirking over his wine glass. He's out. Finished. Old men don't need trusts anyway. I buttered my bread in slow strokes, not looking up. My silence drew more attention than any protest could have. A few relatives glanced at me with pity, others with amusement. Let them. They were spectators, not players. But as I lifted my water glass, I caught my brother's eyes across the table. For the first time, he seemed unsettled. Perhaps it was the calm in my gaze, the absence of reaction. Perhaps he wondered why I hadn't barked back, why I hadn't stormed out. He didn't know silence can be a countdown. At night, alone again at my desk, I arranged the documents in order. The original trust, the deeds, the loan agreements. Each one was a stone, and together they formed a wall. I didn't need to announce my plan. I only needed to wait for him to lean too heavily against that wall. And he would. Smiles don't hold weight. The moment came sooner than I expected. A letter arrived by certified mail, its envelope crisp, the handwriting formal. I signed for it, closed the door, and slid it open with a letter opener. Inside, a notice of attempted transfer. My brother had tried to move property from the trust into his name alone. The bank had flagged it. The letter was addressed to me because my name was still on every binding document. I sat back in my chair, the corners of my mouth tightening. Not a smile, not yet. Just recognition. Paper doesn't forget. I placed the letter in my drawer with the others, neat as a judge's gavel. Outside, the city hummed with its endless noise. Inside, my silence grew heavier, denser, waiting. My brother thought he had erased me. But the truth was this. My name was inked deeper than he could reach. And one day soon, he would discover that silence doesn't mean absence. It means presence, sharpened into something stronger than words. The first time I saw my brother boast publicly, it wasn't at a family table. It was in the country club dining hall, a place heavy with brass light fixtures and polished oak chairs. I hadn't wanted to be there. I rarely went anymore, but an old friend invited me for lunch. That's when I heard it. My brother, glass in hand, surrounded by men in suits and women in pearls, laughing as if betrayal were a business deal. "Richard," he said to them, his voice raised just enough to carry. "He's done. Out of the trust. Poor man spent his life shuffling papers. And for what? No seat at the table anymore." Laughter rippled across the room. It wasn't everyone. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my eyes, but the sound landed like nails against glass. I stirred my coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against porcelain. My friend glanced at me, waiting for a reaction. I gave none. My silence wasn't weakness. It was reconnaissance. I had learned something crucial that day. My brother believed reputation was currency. He wanted people to see him as victorious, powerful, untouchable. He measured wealth not just in accounts, but in whispers and nods. That meant his downfall would have to be public, not just financial. I didn't need to ruin his accounts alone. I needed to ruin his image. That night, back at my desk, I opened the drawer of documents again. The trust, the deeds, the loan agreements, the certified letter silent witnesses, all of them. They didn't laugh, they didn't smirk. They waited. I took out a fresh notebook, the kind with faint blue lines that kept words straight. At the top of the page, I wrote in firm letters, "Paper never lies." Below it, I began drafting. Not arguments timelines, not anger facts. I drew arrows from one deed to the next, traced loan obligations, highlighted clauses that spoke louder than any lawyer's amendment. Each line I wrote wasn't just ink, it was a tether binding my brother's arrogance to the paper trail he had ignored. A week later, he called me. His voice was sharp, impatient. "Richard, I hear you've been poking around the county records. That's not necessary. Things are handled." Handled. Asmach word. I let a pause stretch before answering. "I like to keep my own copies. Paper doesn't forget." Silence on the other end. Then a short laugh. "You're wasting your time. Everyone knows where things stand. Everyone." He always thought the crowd mattered more than the contract. "Maybe," I said softly. And then I ended the call. The truth was, I had already uncovered more than he realized. One of the properties he claimed an old rental house our parents had kept still carried liens that required dual trustee signatures. His attempt to transfer it into his name had been denied once already. He would try again, and each time my silence would be the wall he couldn't climb. I didn't need to shout. The bank would do it for me. But I also knew this. Quiet victories in paper would not satisfy an audience. And though I had no interest in applause, I understood the importance of witnesses. My brother wanted to humiliate me in public. I would let the paper humiliate him in return. That meant patience, timing, the right stage. The stage appeared sooner than I expected. The local newspaper ran a small feature about community estates, a dry piece tucked in the business section. My brother's name appeared there, mentioned as primary trustee of the Hale family holdings. I read it twice, not because I doubted, but because I saw the opportunity. I folded the paper, set it on the desk, and pulled out the certified letter again. Primary trustee? The bank's letter had already contradicted that. Silence was beginning to echo. At the next family dinner, my brother was louder still. He raised his glass and told the cousins how the trust was, finally, in capable hands. He told them he was streamlining the holdings, that old complications had been removed. Old complications. That was me. I cut my chicken in slow, deliberate strokes. I kept my eyes on the plate. But I felt the moment come his need for me to protest, to give him something to laugh at. I gave him nothing. Instead, when the meal ended, I placed a folded paper on the table beside my plate. I didn't slide it toward him, didn't announce it, just left it there, neat and silent. As I stood to leave, I saw him glance at it. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, because he recognized the seal, a certified copy. Paper doesn't smirk, paper starts back. That night, I didn't pour bourbon. I poured tea, the kind my wife used to drink at night, chamomile with a faint honey aftertaste. I sat by the window, watching headlights smear against wet streets, and let the quiet deepen. Revenge wasn't a strike. It was erosion. Steady, patient, inevitable. And the first cracks had appeared. Days turned into weeks. My brother's voice carried farther in town speeches at the club, conversations at church, jokes at the grocery store. But each time he grew louder, I tightened the noose in paper. The bank had already flagged one transaction. The county clerk flagged another. My folder thickened with documents, each stamped with dates that told a story his smile could never erase. I said nothing, but the silence was filling rooms he hadn't noticed yet. The moment I knew things were turning was small, almost unremarkable. I went to the bank to withdraw some cash. The teller, a woman who had worked there since my days as an officer, leaned closer as she counted the bills. "Your brother was in here," she murmured, lowering her voice, trying to move things around. "Manager told him it couldn't be done without you." I nodded once, slipped the bills into my wallet. Outside, I let the cold air fill my lungs. For the first time in months, I felt warmth in my chest. Not happiness, something harder, sharper. The world was beginning to remember my name. At home, I added a new heading to my notebook, countermove. Under it, I wrote one sentence, steady, deliberate. Do nothing loud. Let the paper speak. And so I waited. The days were ordinary, reading the paper, walking the park, writing notes at the desk. But beneath each ordinary hour, the silence deepened. It wasn't emptiness. It was gathering. And when it broke, it would not be me raising my voice. It would be the bank. But it already mattered, because now he was calling me. The cracks spread further at the club. He had been telling everyone for weeks that he controlled the trust, that I was finished. But when he tried to use one of the properties as collateral for a loan, the banker, a man I'd once trained, shook his head. "I'm afraid we'll need Richard's authorization," he told him, polite but firm. I wasn't there, but word travels quickly in a small city. By the next morning, I heard about his outburst. He had raised his voice, accused the bank of incompetence, demanded exceptions. But banks don't make exceptions for smirks. They make demands for signatures. And my signature was the one that counted. That evening, I walked home from the clerk's office with a copy of the loan attempt in my coat pocket. The air smelled of wood smoke from chimneys, the first bite of winter settling in. I thought of my father again, his hand steady on my shoulder as he taught me to sign my name in careful cursive. He had always said, "Your word is weight, Richard. Don't spend it lightly." I hadn't, and now that weight pressed squarely against my brother's chest. At the next family dinner, he tried to maintain the mask. He poured wine, laughed too loud, told stories of his plans for the estate. But I noticed the shift. His eyes darted to me more often, searching, measuring. I gave him nothing. I buttered my bread, nodded when spoken to, cut my meat into neat slices. My silence unsettled him more than any confrontation could. And when dessert was served, I placed another folded document beside my plate. Not a letter this time, an official notice of denied transfer. I left it there when I rose from the table, chair sliding back with a soft scrape. As I walked away, I caught the flicker of unease in his smirk, because once again, the paper did not smile. The truth was, I didn't need to chase him. I only needed to wait. Every attempt he made to secure his grip on the trust ran headfirst into the wall I had quietly built. My name, etched into every clause, stamped onto every deed, signed into every loan. It wasn't revenge yet. It was positioning. Revenge would come when the silence grew too loud to ignore. A week later, it did. The local paper ran a follow-up story on community estates. This time, buried in the business section, was a small note about legal complications with the Hale Trust. No details, just a whisper. But whisper spread. At the club, people asked him questions. At church, neighbors murmured. At the grocery store, someone asked if everything was all right with the properties. And that was how silence began to speak publicly. Not with shouts, but with doubts. Not with confrontations, but with questions. Questions that he couldn't answer without admitting he wasn't in control. I watched from a distance, quietly. I saw the cracks forming in his smile, the sharpness in his voice when conversations turned toward business. I noticed the way he avoided my eyes now at dinners, the way he hurried through explanations. For the first time, the man who had laughed in my face was no longer laughing. He was cornered, not by me shouting, not by me accusing, but by paper, silent and permanent, with my name written at the top. And as I sat at my desk that night, filing away the latest newspaper clipping, I realized something. The revenge had already begun. I hadn't lifted a hand, hadn't raised my voice. All I had done was let silence do what it always does, wait until the weight of truth crushed the noise. My brother thought he had erased me, but the truth was simple, unshakable. I was the ink he couldn't blot out. The letter from the bank had been the first fracture, but the courthouse was where the crack began to widen. I walked into the building on a Tuesday morning, the marble floors cold beneath my shoes, the air carrying that faint scent of old paper and disinfectant. Courthouses never changed the echoes, the muffled shuffling of people who'd rather be anywhere else, the hush that feels heavier than any cathedral. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to confront. I was there to file. A quiet clerk in a beige sweater looked up when I stepped to the counter. I placed a folder before her, neat and square, edges aligned. Inside, certified copies of deeds, trust documents, and the bank's denial letter with my name at the top. She didn't ask questions. She only checked the seals, typed notes into her terminal, and stamped the filings with that heavy, final sound that carries more weight than any gavel. With each stamp, my brother's smirk grew thinner, though he didn't know it yet. By the time I walked back into daylight, the winter sun was pale, weak against the cold air. I pulled my coat tighter around me and let the city noise fill my ears. Horns, footsteps, the chatter of strangers, all of it distant, because I could already see the ripple spreading. It wouldn't be tomorrow or the next day, but soon enough, the papers I'd filed would reach the people who mattered. Bankers, county recorders, title companies. And when they read my name, when they saw the dates, the clauses, the denials, they would know the truth. I didn't need to tell them. Paper would tell them for me. That evening, my brother called. His voice was sharper than usual, brittle around the edges. "Richard," he said, no greeting. "What did you file?" Silence stretched between us, long enough for him to feel it. "Don't play games," he snapped. "I've had calls, questions, people saying you've been submitting documents. You can't just—" "I can," I said quietly. "And I have." For a moment, only his breathing filled the line. Then the laugh came, hollow, forced. "You think this will stop me? You think a few papers will undo what's already decided?" "Nothing is decided," I answered. "Paper doesn't forget." I ended the call. The first true strike didn't come from me. It came from the courthouse itself. 2 weeks later, his attempt to lease one of the trust properties, a modest commercial space on the edge of town, was halted. The prospective tenant backed out after learning of legal disputes in the filings. My brother fumed, his reputation quietly bleeding in the community. I heard about it from a former colleague at the bank. He told me my brother had stormed into the branch, red-faced, demanding to know who was sabotaging him, but no one had to answer. The documents answered for themselves. I went home that night, poured a single bourbon, and sat at the desk where my father's photograph hung above me. His steady eyes looked down as if approving. I remembered one of his sayings, "Control isn't loud, Richard. Control is when they can't move without your hand." My brother was learning that lesson now, painfully, one denial at a time. Still, he didn't stop. Men like him never do. He doubled down, telling anyone who would listen that it was a temporary snag, that I was just an old man clinging to scraps. But scraps don't get stamped by a courthouse. Scraps don't carry embossed seals. Scraps don't stop tenants from signing leases. Every word he spoke in public became lighter, hollower, against the weight of stamped paper. And slowly, The whispers began to shift. At the club, someone asked him casual, over dinner, why the lease hadn't gone through. He stammered, offered excuses, changed the subject. At church, a neighbor asked me quietly if everything was all right with the trust. I simply nodded. No more. That silence spoke louder than any denial. In the grocery store, I overheard two acquaintances whispering about complications in the Hale estate. It had begun. The erosion of his image, slow but irreversible. But the moment that told me the tide had truly turned came from the most unlikely place. The same attorney who had once slid those amendment papers across the table. He called me. His tone was neutral, clipped, but beneath it, I sensed unease. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I've been contacted by your brother regarding certain filings. There appear to be inconsistencies. I trust you are aware?" "I'm aware," I said. Silence stretched across the line, then, "Well, the court will sort it out, I'm sure." I could almost hear the discomfort in his voice. He had seen men like my brother before, loud, confident, certain of their power. And he had seen them undone by ink and silence. That night, I walked the streets alone, the city cold and damp around me. Street lights cast yellow halos on wet pavement, and the sound of my shoes echoed in rhythm. I thought of my wife again, her hand warm against mine years ago as she whispered, "Don't let them dishonor you." He hadn't. The dishonor was theirs now, spreading slowly like cracks in ice. I returned home, set the kettle on the stove, and poured tea instead of bourbon. The steam curled upward, faint and fleeting against the chill of the room. On the desk, the stack of documents looked heavier than ever, though nothing had changed but the angle of the lamplight. But I knew the first strike had landed, and it hadn't been loud or messy or dramatic. It had been stamped, sealed, filed, permanent. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, just after dawn. I was shaving slow strokes with an old safety razor when the ring echoed through the apartment. The sound was too urgent, too insistent, not the casual call of a friend. I wiped my face, picked up the receiver, and listened. "Mr. Hale?" a voice asked. Not my brother, a banker. One I'd known years ago, younger than me back then, older now, his tone heavy. "There's been an issue with your brother's accounts. I thought you should know." I didn't ask why he was calling me. I already knew. Paper had placed my name where my brother thought he had erased it. The banker explained, "My brother had attempted to leverage one of the trust properties for a loan. A bold move, the kind only a man drunk on confidence would try. But the loan had stalled. Why? Because my signature was missing. And without it, the application was nothing more than paper with blank spaces." He wasn't pleased, the banker added almost wry. He stormed out. "I don't imagine this will be the last of it." "No," I said quietly. "It won't." I hung up the phone and stared at the steam curling from my half-shaved razor. My reflection in the mirror stared back, gray eyes steady, lips set. The first financial blow had landed. That afternoon, the whispers grew louder. At the club, someone mentioned the failed loan. At the grocery store, a man I'd barely spoken to in years approached me and asked if I was still involved in the trust. "Still," I said softly. "I always was." I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The truth was seeping out through cracks my brother couldn't patch with smiles. At dinner that weekend, the tension was thicker than the gravy. My brother filled his glass too often, laughed too loud, told the same stories twice. Our cousins nodded politely, but their eyes flicked toward me, curious, questioning. When dessert arrived, he leaned back in his chair and smirked at me, though it lacked the sharpness it once carried. "You've been busy," he said lightly, as if it were a joke. I buttered a roll, calm, unhurried. "Paper doesn't forget." The words landed like a stone dropped in a pond. No splash, just ripples that spread outward, touching every corner of the table. He didn't smirk again that night. The truth hit harder a week later. He had tried again another property, another attempted transfer. And again, it had been denied. This time, the bank had escalated, notifying him in writing, with my name printed at the top of the notice. I received a copy too. The envelope was thick, the paper heavier than usual, as though it carried more than just ink. And in a way, it did. It carried his failure. That evening, I laid the notice on my desk, smoothing the folds with steady hands. Around it, the other documents spread like a circle of witnesses. Each page bore seals, signatures, denials. Together, they formed a story my brother couldn't rewrite. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a smile. Not wide, not triumphant, just a thin curve of recognition. Because I knew this wasn't just a snag for him. It was the beginning of collapse. By the end of the month, the cracks were visible to everyone. The tenant he'd promised for the commercial property had walked away. The bank refused his loan applications. Even the attorney who had once helped him amend the trust began to distance himself, citing complexities beyond his expertise. And the whispers spread. Did you hear the bank wouldn't release the property? They say Richard's still on the papers. Maybe the trust isn't what he claimed. Each murmur stripped another layer from his smirk. I encountered him once on the street outside the courthouse. He looked tired, his coat wrinkled, his eyes shadowed. But when he saw me, he tried to muster the old expression, the half smile. Enjoying yourself? He asked bitterly. I met his eyes. This isn't about enjoyment. It's about balance. He opened his mouth as if to reply, then closed it again. For the first time, he had no words. I walked past him without looking back. At home, I poured tea instead of bourbon. My wife's photograph watched from the shelf, her smile soft, eternal. You told me not to let them dishonor me, I whispered. I haven't. The steam rose from the cup, fragile but steady. Outside, winter pressed against the windows. Inside, the silence was warm. Because I knew, my brother had just lost his first real piece of the game, and the rest would follow. It was snowing the morning I decided to buy his house. The flakes drifted sideways across the city, soft as ash, melting into the blacktop the moment they landed. I walked slowly through the whitened streets, collar turned up against the cold, my hands tucked into my coat pockets. I wasn't rushing. Patience had been my weapon all along, and this was the moment it mattered most. At the corner, the bank loomed brick and limestone, tall windows fogged against the winter air. I'd spent half my life inside that building. I knew its hallways, its vaults, the sound of its elevators groaning upward. I knew its people, too, and they still knew me. Inside, the heat fogged my glasses. I removed them, wiped them clean with a folded handkerchief, and walked to the desk. The manager rose when he saw me older now, his hair graying at the edges, but the same young man I'd trained decades earlier. Richard, he said warmly, shaking my hand. It's been too long. Too long, I agreed. My voice was steady, polite. Nothing in my tone suggested the storm beneath the surface. We sat in his office, the walls lined with framed certificates, the faint smell of paper and coffee lingering. I didn't waste words. I'd like to discuss the Hale mortgage, I said. His eyebrows lifted, but only slightly. Bankers learn quickly not to show surprise. You're aware, he began carefully, that your brother is the listed mortgagor, and I'm aware of the arrears, I interrupted softly. I'd like to buy the note. Silence stretched. He studied me, weighing not the request but the man making it. Finally, he nodded once. I'll see what can be done. The process took weeks. Banks don't hurry for anyone, not even former officers. But time was my ally, not my enemy. While my brother blustered at the club, while he complained to relatives, while he spread lies about my obstruction, I waited. Each day the file sat on the manager's desk. Interest accrued. Each day my brother's position weakened, though he didn't know why. And when the papers were ready, I signed them with the same careful hand my father had taught me decades earlier. My name flowed in steady ink across the page, binding me to the note that once bound my brother. Ownership had shifted, quietly, legally, without a single raised voice. The house where he smirked, where he laughed about my erasure, now belonged to me. I didn't tell him, not yet. Silence is more powerful when it lingers in shadows. Instead, I went home and filed the documents in my drawer. They joined the trust papers, the denial letters, the stamped filings. Together, they formed a fortress no smile could breach. I poured myself a bourbon that night, the first in weeks. The glass clinked softly against the wood as I set it down. My wife's photograph watched from the shelf, her eyes calm, unchanging. I bought his house today, I said aloud. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. He doesn't know, not yet. I raised the glass to her picture, then drank. The burn of bourbon slid down my throat, warm against the cold silence. The first sign he suspected came at a family gathering. He looked restless, his hands twitching around his glass, his smile tighter than usual. Richard, he said suddenly, in front of everyone, you've been busy. Care to share what you've been up to? The table fell quiet. Forks paused in midair, eyes flicked between us. I set my napkin down carefully, met his eyes, and said only, paper doesn't forget. The cousins shifted, uneasy. Someone coughed, and my brother's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. I returned to my meal without another word. He called me late that night, his voice ragged with anger. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Nothing loud," I replied. "Don't play games, Richard," his voice cracked. "I've had calls question someone mentioned the mortgage." I let silence stretch until his breath quickened. Then I said softly, "Control isn't loud. Control is when they can't move without your hand." He cursed, shouted, but I held the receiver away from my ear, listening not to his words but to the desperation in them. Finally, I placed the receiver back in its cradle, cutting off his voice mid-sentence. The click of the phone was louder than his shouting. The weeks that followed were winter gray, ordinary on the surface. I walked the park, fed pigeons, bought groceries. To anyone watching, I was just an old man passing time. But beneath the quiet, his world was crumbling. I knew it from the letters I received, formal notices, copies of correspondence, his name listed in arrears. I knew it from the whispers in town, the questions that followed him like shadows. And I knew it from the silence of his calls. He had stopped phoning, stopped confronting. Silence wasn't just mine anymore. It was his too, forced upon him. One evening, I passed by his house. Snow blanketed the roof, the shutters drawn tight. Through the window, I glimpsed him pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand cutting the air with sharp gestures. He was shouting at someone, banker, lawyer, cousin, it didn't matter. His voice rose, his gestures wild, but the walls held his words in. Outside, the snow muffled everything. I stood there for a moment, the cold air biting my face, then turned and walked on. Because I didn't need to hear. I already knew. The house was mine. At my desk that night, I wrote a single line in my notebook under the heading countermove. The trap is set. Let him step into it. The first notice went out in January. It wasn't loud, no confrontation, no scene, just a white envelope printed with neat black letters. Payment past due. My name was on the top, not his. Mine. I didn't send it myself, the bank did. That was the beauty of it. I didn't have to raise my voice, didn't have to soil my hands. Paper carried my silence straight into his mailbox. I pictured him opening it at his dining table, the smirk fading as his eyes scanned the page. He would see my name there, steady, permanent, undeniable. And I imagined the silence in that room after he read it. Not the silence of strength, the silence of realization. A week later, I passed by him at the club. His face was pale, his smile forced. He raised his glass when he saw me, but the gesture was stiff, mechanical. "Richard," he said loudly, loud enough for others to hear. "Good to see you." I nodded once. "Paper doesn't forget." A few men nearby frowned, confused. He chuckled nervously, tried to wave it off, but the words hung there, heavy, unexplained. Whispers followed him out of the room. The second notice came in February. This one sharper, less polite. Delinquent account. Corrective action required. Again, my name at the top. Again, the seal, the weight of law pressed into the paper. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I simply folded the notice, slid it into my drawer with the others, and waited. Silence was the lock. Time was the key. Together, they closed the door around him. By March, the whispers in town had grown louder than his laughter. At the grocery store, I heard two women discussing trouble with the Hale place. At church, a deacon leaned close and asked me if everything was all right with the family estate. "I'm patient," I told him simply, and that was all I said. The cracks became visible even at family dinners. He no longer filled the table with his laughter. He drank more, spoke less, eyes darting toward me when he thought no one noticed. I noticed. I always noticed. One evening, he tried to corner me after dessert, his voice low and urgent. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "We can work something out. We're brothers." I studied his face, the lines of desperation, the sweat at his temples. For the first time, he wasn't smirking. He was pleading. I leaned closer, my voice calm, steady. Brothers don't erase each other. And then I walked away. The third notice was final. Foreclosure proceedings will begin if arrears are not resolved. The words were plain, unadorned. Banks don't waste ink on sympathy. I laid the letter flat on my desk, smoothing the folds with steady fingers. Around it, the other documents spread like shadows, trust papers, denials, mortgage agreements. Together, they formed a noose he had tied himself. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't threatened. I had only waited, silent, while the paper spoke for me. He called me late that night, his voice cracked, broken. "Richard," he rasped, "please, You don't understand. They'll take the house. I understand, I said softly. Silence stretched across the line, broken only by his breathing. It was a mistake, he whispered. To trust what I did, it was stupid. I thought I could. You thought silence was weakness, I said. You were wrong. I ended the call. The click of the receiver rang louder than his words. The eviction notice would come next. Not from me, from the court, from the sheriff, from the machinery of law that moved at its own pace. All I had to do was wait, and I was patient. That night I poured tea instead of bourbon. The steam rose in slow curls, catching the lamplight. My wife's photograph watched from the shelf, her smile gentle, her eyes unyielding. You told me not to let them dishonor me, I whispered, and I haven't. Outside, snow fell again, quiet, steady. Inside, silence reigned. And somewhere across town, my brother sat in a house he no longer owned, surrounded by walls that already carried my name. Foreclosure is not a thunderclap. It doesn't arrive with flashing lights or raised voices. It is quieter than that. It begins with letters thin, official envelopes slipped through mail slots. Then it spreads to phone calls, polite but firm, reminding the debtor of obligations unmet. After that come the notices tacked to doors, their language sharper, colder. And finally, it arrives in public. For my brother, it arrived in spring, when the sheriff's office pinned the first notice to his front door. I didn't need to be there, I didn't need to watch. But I was. I stood across the street beneath a budding maple tree, my coat collar turned up, my hands folded behind my back. The deputy worked quickly, hammering the notice into place with 2 sharp taps. Then he walked away, his boots leaving faint marks in the soft soil. The paper flapped faintly in the breeze, white against the dark wood of the door. From the window, I saw the curtain twitch. A moment later, my brother stepped out, his face pale, his hand shaking as he tore the notice down. He looked around the street, searching, but I was just another man beneath a tree. I turned and walked away, the sound of birdsong mixing with the rustle of paper in the wind. By the weekend, whispers spread faster than pollen. At the club, men lowered their voices when he entered, their questions sharper than their smiles. At church, families leaned together in pews, murmuring. At the grocery store, I heard his name paired with words like foreclosure and arrears. He tried to laugh it off, of course. He always did. It's nothing, he told them, waving his hand. Just a misunderstanding. Temporary paperwork. Richard's meddling. But his voice cracked, and people heard it. I received a call from the bank manager that same week. Richard, he said, his tone careful, I thought you should know your brother's mortgage is officially in default. Foreclosure proceedings will continue unless balance is restored. Thank you, he replied. I didn't ask for details, I didn't gloat. I only hung up the phone and sat in silence, letting the weight of the words settle. Default. Proceedings. Terms that carried no emotion, yet sliced deeper than any insult. At dinner the following Sunday, the silence was heavy. My brother arrived late, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes shadowed. He avoided mine, but every cousin at the table looked between us, waiting for something. No one mentioned the foreclosure outright, but it hung there, unspoken, thicker than the roast steam rising from the platter. When dessert came, I set a folded paper on the table beside my plate. Not a notice this time, a copy of the mortgage transfer agreement. My name clear at the top. I didn't say a word. I rose, tucked my napkin onto the table, and left. Behind me, the silence broke into whispers. The following week, he came to my apartment. I heard the knock at the door, 3 sharp raps, uneven, impatient. I opened it to find him on the threshold, his coat open, his hair uncombed. Richard, he said, his voice tight. We need to talk. I stepped aside, let him in. He paced the living room, hands running through his hair. You can't let them take the house, he said finally, turning to me. It's everything I have. You don't understand. I understand, I said quietly. I own the note. His eyes widened. For the first time, I saw true fear in them. Not anger, not arrogance fear. You? He whispered. Yes. He sank into the chair across from me, his hands gripping the armrest as if the room were spinning. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Because you erased me, I said simply. And paper doesn't forget. He begged, then, pleaded, words spilling from him in broken sentences. He spoke of mistakes, of family, of brotherhood. He promised repayment, promised change. I listened, silent, the way one listens to the last notes of a song already ended. When he finished, I stood. This was never about repayment. This was about balance. And then I opened the door. He sat frozen for a moment, then rose and stumbled out, his footsteps uneven on the hallway floor. I closed the door behind him with a soft click. The notices continued. More papers pinned to his door. More letters slipped into his mailbox. Each one carried my name. Each one stripped another layer from his pride. And the whispers grew louder. Did you hear the bank's taking the house? They say Richard owns the note. Imagine after everything, he's the one holding the deed. I didn't confirm, didn't deny. I walked the park, fed the birds, nodded politely at neighbors. Silence carried me while paper carried the truth. One evening, I passed his house again. The windows were dark, the yard unkempt. Another notice flapped on the door, its corners curling in the damp air. I stood for a moment watching the wind tug at it, then turned and walked on. The house wasn't his anymore. It hadn't been for weeks. It was mine. That night, I poured bourbon, slow and steady, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. I raised the glass toward my wife's photograph, her smile soft and steady as ever. They're losing it, I whispered. The house, the name, the smirk. The bourbon burned as it slid down, but the warmth that spread wasn't fire. It was closure, slow and cold. Foreclosure doesn't end with a notice on a door. It ends with a key turning in a lock that no longer belongs to you. For my brother, that day came in April, on a gray morning when the trees had just begun to bud and the air smelled faintly of rain. The sheriff's car parked in front of his house, lights off, engine humming. A deputy stepped out with a clipboard, his boots crunching over damp gravel. He walked up the path, knocked once, then waited. I stood at the corner, hands in my coat pockets, watching. The door opened slowly. My brother appeared, his hair uncombed, his shirt half buttoned. His face was pale, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The deputy handed him the papers. My brother scanned them with shaking hands, his lips moving silently over the words. Then he sagged against the doorframe, as if the weight of ink alone had broken his bones. I turned away before he saw me, because it wasn't my voice evicting him, it was paper. That afternoon, I met with the bank. The process was routine, clinical, documents slid across the table, signatures applied, seals pressed. Each sound, the scratch of the pen, the thump of the stamp, was another nail closing the door on him. When it was done, the manager handed me the keys. "They're yours now," he said simply. I held them in my palm, the cold metal biting against my skin. Keys to a house that wasn't mine by birthright anymore, but by silence, patience, and paper. I didn't rush to use them. I let them sit on my desk for a week, glinting faintly in the lamplight. My brother still lingered in the house, delaying the inevitable, clinging to walls that no longer carried his name. But paper doesn't wait forever. When the deadline passed, the deputy returned. This time, I went too. The day was clear, the sky a hard blue that made the world look sharper. I walked up the familiar path, the deputy beside me. My brother stood on the porch, his face hollow, his eyes empty. Boxes were stacked near the door, hastily packed, lids half closed. He looked at me when I approached, his gaze filled with something I couldn't name. Anger, fear, shame, all twisted together. "You," he whispered. I met his eyes. Me. For a moment, silence hung between us, heavy and unbroken. Then the deputy cleared his throat, motioned toward the boxes. My brother lowered his head, lifted one box, and walked past me. He didn't speak again. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, final as a coffin lid. Inside, the house smelled of dust and stale air. Curtains hung crooked, furniture scuffed, carpets worn. It was no palace, just a house, walls and wood and windows. But it was mine. I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps echoing against bare walls. In the kitchen, I touched the counter where our mother once set pies to cool. In the living room, I ran my hand along the mantel where our father once placed trophies and photographs. Memories clung to every corner, ghosts of laughter and dinners and arguments. My brother had thought he could erase me from this house, but now every wall whispered my name back to me. I didn't move in. I didn't need to. Owning it was enough. Instead, I locked the door, slipped the keys into my pocket, and walked away. Behind me, the house stood silent, its windows staring blankly out at the street. My brother's boxes sat on the curb, his smirk packed away with the rest of his things. Paper had spoken. Paper had won. The whispers spread quickly after that. They say Richard owns the house now. Did you hear? He evicted him. After everything he did to Richard, can you imagine? The smirk that had once filled every room with arrogance was gone. In its place, only silence. And silence was mine. That night, I sat at my desk, the keys resting on the wood beside my wife's photograph. Her eyes, calm and steady, seemed to watch them with approval. "You told me not to let them dishonor me," I whispered. "I didn't." I poured bourbon, lifted the glass, and let the warmth burn slow and steady down my throat. Outside, the world was quiet. Inside, silence reigned. And for the first time in years, I felt whole again. The first call didn't come from my brother. It came from a cousin, a woman I'd grown up with, who used to braid my sister's hair on the porch when we were children. Her voice trembled over the line, careful, polite. "Richard," she began, "I thought you should know your brother is struggling. Things have been difficult. Maybe if you could—" Her words trailed off, leaving the request unsaid, but not unrecognized. I let silence stretch before I answered. "Paper doesn't forget," I said at last. She sighed, soft and resigned, as if she'd known that would be my answer. And then she hung up. The second call came from an uncle, his tone sharper. "You've made your point, Richard," he said. "He's lost the house, his reputation's ruined. Enough is enough. He's still family." "Family?" The word rang hollow, empty as a shell. "Family doesn't erase each other," I replied. There was no response, only a click as the line went dead. By the third call, I stopped answering. The phone rang, again and again, each ring echoing through the apartment. I let it ring until the sound became part of the silence, then faded. They wanted me to stop. They wanted me to undo what they had let him do to me years ago. But silence cannot be undone. The first time I saw him after the eviction, it was at another family dinner. He arrived late, his suit wrinkled, his tie crooked, his eyes sunken. He sat across from me, but he didn't smirk. He didn't laugh. He didn't fill the room with his voice. Instead, he stared at his plate, pushing food around without eating. The cousins glanced between us, waiting, as if expecting me to reach out, to speak, to forgive. But I said nothing. Silence was my answer. After dinner, one of the cousins followed me out to the street. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of lilacs from a nearby yard. "Richard," she said softly, "don't you think it's gone far enough? He's broken." I looked at her, the streetlight casting pale gold across her face. "He thought silence was weakness," I said. "Now he knows it isn't." She lowered her eyes, said nothing more, and walked away. At home, I sat at my desk, the keys to his old house resting on the wood beside my wife's photograph. The lamplight cast long shadows across the papers still stacked neatly in the drawer. I thought of my father again, his voice steady as he told us, "Trust his weight. Don't drop it." My brother had dropped it, casually, arrogantly, in front of lawyers and cousins and neighbors. He had laughed as he erased me. Now the weight had fallen back on him, and it was crushing him. The calls didn't stop. Some begged, some scolded, some tried to bargain, offering favors, promises, even apologies that came years too late. I answered none of them, because there was nothing left to say. One evening, I passed him on the street. He was thinner now, his coat hanging loose on his shoulders. He carried a worn briefcase, scuffed at the corners as if it had been dragged more than carried. He saw me, paused, then lowered his eyes and kept walking. For the first time in our lives, he didn't smirk, he didn't laugh, he didn't even speak. And that silence, his silence was the only apology I ever needed. That night, I sat at the window with a cup of tea, steam rising in faint curls. Outside, the city hummed with its endless rhythm cars, footsteps, distant sirens. Inside, the silence was complete, whole, unbroken. I thought of my wife's last words again. "Don't let them dishonor you." They hadn't. They never would again. But the story wasn't finished. Because soon, the family itself would gather not to laugh at me, not to smirk with him, but to beg. And I would show them with silence what true power meant. They called it a family meeting. It was held at my cousin's house, the one with the long dining table and the heavy curtains that never quite closed against the draft. When I arrived, the air already felt thick, as though the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. The table was full cousins, uncles, aunts, all the ones who had once looked at me with pity, or amusement, or dismissal. And at the far end sat my brother. His shoulders were slumped, his face hollow, his suit hanging from him like borrowed cloth. He didn't smirk. He didn't laugh. He only stared at the table in front of him. The talk began quickly. "We're family," one cousin said. "We have to help him," another added. "It's gone far enough, Richard." an uncle said firmly. I listened. I let their voices wash over me, all of them threading the same plea: mercy, forgiveness, intervention. Finally, one of them slid a folder across the table toward me. Legal papers. A request. Richard, my cousin said, if you sign, we can stop the proceedings. We can restore balance. Please. All eyes turned to me. The room fell silent, waiting. I rested my hand on the folder. The paper was cool, the edges sharp. I opened it slowly, scanned the words. They were neat, clean, written in the sterile language of law. All it required was a signature, my signature, to undo months, years, decades of betrayal. I closed the folder. My hand remained on it for a long moment. The silence stretched until even the clock on the wall seemed afraid to tick. Then I slid the folder back across the table. I won't sign, I said quietly. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, protests. Richard, please, he's your brother. This will ruin him. I looked at them all, one by one. Their faces flushed with desperation. Their voices cracked with urgency. Then I turned my gaze to my brother. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look away. His lips trembled as if he might speak, but no words came. Only silence. And in that silence, everything was answered. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape. You erased me, I said, my voice steady, calm. Paper doesn't forget, and neither do I. I adjusted my coat, nodded once to the room, and walked out. No one followed. Outside, the evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain. I walked down the quiet street, each step measured, unhurried. In my pocket, the keys to his old house pressed against my hand, solid, undeniable. I thought of my father's lessons, my mother's smile, my wife's final whisper. Don't let them dishonor you. They hadn't. Not anymore. That night, I sat at my desk one last time. The papers lay stacked neatly in the drawer, each one stamped, sealed, permanent. The keys lay beside them, glinting faintly in the lamplight. I poured a bourbon, raised the glass to my wife's photograph, and spoke aloud into the stillness. I never raised my voice, I said softly, and yet my silence wrote their ending. The bourbon burned as it slid down, warm and slow. Outside, the night deepened into silence. Inside, I let it rest, whole and final, and I never spoke of it again.